what was the other one? I forgot some of the other books of those I knew. The Home for Peculiar Children, which has been adapted recently by Tim Burton. In all of those, the characters don't really know their homeland or don't ever mention them, and they go across the world without being able to settle anywhere. And that's an entirely different way to build the world in the first place. So these religious points of view actually are deeply influencing the way fantasy is constructed on a very subconscious level, actually. Of course, there's also a lot of conscious use of fantasy tropes, and this was pointed out by other colleagues who have been researching on this. And religious tropes tend up appearing on very different levels and very different ways. You can have them on a very superficial level, as in when you walk into and you say there is no religion in this world, but suddenly you end up walking into a church. Or you can actually have the fact that religious tropes are a structuring part of the world without it being actually religious. That is, in your fantasy world, there are angels, there are demons. Nobody believes in God, and there is no faith, but there is angels, and that's the way it is. And of course, that on the other hand can also be dissociated in a very interesting way from the religion of the characters themselves, actually, especially if you have a world that intersects a real world, so to speak. Then you can have, as in the works of Cassandra Clare, her young adult fantasy sagas, there's characters who become vampires and who have very diverse religions from their background, and so there can be a character who is grown up Jewish, but in becoming a vampire has an entirely different experience than the Christian vampires, and which ends up being a very strange situation, as the religious fantastical magical tropes of religion are dissociated from the actual religion as belief. I myself was talking about Neil Gaiman again, as usual, this time much more about fairies and fairy markets, which in the perspective of world building is of course also very curious, because what Gaiman does is also making these boundaries of the worlds very fluid through these spaces in between, which are, let me find some nice picture I can show from the fairy market.